6 months after the now famous encounter, the ripple effects of Emma's simple hug continued to spread in ways that neither she nor James could have imagined. The viral video had accumulated over 2 million views across various social media platforms, and the story had been featured in documentaries about human kindness and the power of innocent gestures to transcend cultural boundaries. For James Mitchell, the experience had fundamentally altered his approach to service. While he maintained the same rigorous standards of ceremonial duty, he carried himself with a renewed sense of purpose and connection to the people he served. His commanding officers noticed that his already exemplary service had somehow deepened, infused with a warmth that made him a natural mentor for younger guards joining the ranks. The palace had quietly instituted some subtle changes in how guards were instructed to handle respectful interactions with the public. While maintaining strict ceremonial standards, there was now official acknowledgement that showing basic human decency in appropriate circumstances was not incompatible with professional duty. James's response had become an unofficial template for how to balance protocol with humanity. During a private conversation with his commanding officer 6 months later, James learned that his handling of the situation had been noted at the highest levels. "Mitchell," Colonel Harrison had said, "you reminded us all that we're not museum pieces. We're human beings in service to something greater than ourselves, and sometimes that service includes showing the world that honor and humanity can coexist." Emma Thompson, now 9 years old, had returned to her elementary school in Ohio as something of a local celebrity, but rather than letting the attention go to her head, she had channeled the experience into a deeper understanding of kindness and service. Her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, noticed that Emma had become a natural peacemaker in the classroom, always ready to offer comfort to classmates who were upset or struggling. The video had also sparked Emma's interest in learning more about different cultures and traditions around the world. She had become fascinated by the idea that people everywhere have jobs that require them to serve others, and she began writing letters to various service members and public servants, thanking them for their work. Sarah Thompson framed a screenshot from the viral video showing the moment Emma and James looked at each other with mutual recognition and respect. The image hung in their living room as a reminder of the power of simple human connection. "It taught our whole family something important," Sarah often told friends. "Sometimes the most meaningful thing you can do is just acknowledge someone's humanity." The story had also caught the attention of children's book publishers, and the Thompsons were approached about collaborating on a book about Emma's experience. After careful consideration, they agreed to work on a project that would teach children about empathy, respect for service members, and the courage to show kindness, even when it means breaking social conventions. The book, titled "The Guard Who Needed a Hug," became a bestseller in both America and Britain, with proceeds donated to charities supporting military families. Emma insisted that James receive some of the recognition, though palace protocol prevented him from participating directly in promotional activities. What neither Emma nor her family knew was that James had been following their story through news reports and social media updates. He had seen Emma's interviews about kindness and her efforts to thank service members, and he felt a profound sense of pride in the young girl who had touched his life so briefly, but so meaningfully. James had also begun sharing the story during informal talks with new recruits, using it to illustrate that their service was about more than ceremony and tradition. "We serve the people," he would tell young guards. "And sometimes the people serve us right back by reminding us why our work matters." The encounter had particular significance for James's relationship with his own daughter, Rebecca. Now 15 and away at boarding school, Rebecca had initially been embarrassed by the viral video showing her father breaking character. But over time, she came to understand that the moment represented everything admirable about her father's character: his dedication, his kindness, and his ability to recognize what truly mattered. During a weekend visit home, Rebecca surprised James by saying, "Dad, I saw that video of you with the little American girl. I know it was against the rules, but I'm proud that you chose to be kind. It made me realize that all those hours you spend standing guard aren't just about protecting buildings or following orders. You're protecting something good in the world." The conversation moved James to tears, realizing that Emma's simple gesture had not only affected his professional life, but had also deepened his connection with his own child. A year after the incident, the palace arranged for a special ceremony honoring long-serving guards. James was among those recognized, and while the official citation mentioned his exemplary service record, those in attendance knew that his recent demonstration of the human side of duty had played a role in his selection for the honor. During the ceremony, James spotted a familiar small figure in the crowd of dignitaries and guests. Emma Thompson, now 10 years old, stood with her parents in the viewing area, having been invited as part of a cultural exchange program between British and American schools. She had grown taller and more mature, but her bright smile and kind eyes were exactly as James remembered. After the formal ceremony concluded, palace officials discreetly arranged for Emma and James to have a brief supervised reunion. The meeting was private, away from cameras and crowds, allowing them to connect as the friends they had become through their shared moment of humanity. "I never forgot about you," Emma told James earnestly. "I still think about that day all the time." "Did you really have a daughter my age?" James smiled, the formal guard persona completely absent in this private moment. "I do indeed. Her name is Rebecca, and she's grown up a lot since we met. But she still has a kind heart, just like you. In fact, she wanted me to give you this." He handed Emma a letter that Rebecca had written, thanking her for showing such kindness to her father, and for helping people around the world understand that soldiers and guards are people with feelings and families who care about them. Emma clutched the letter carefully, understanding instinctively that this was a treasure more valuable than any souvenir. "Will you tell Rebecca that I think she has a really wonderful dad?" she asked. "I will," James promised. "And I hope you know that what you did that day, showing kindness to a stranger, standing up for what you thought was right, that took real courage. You should be very proud of the young woman you're becoming." As Emma's family prepared to leave, she turned back to James one more time. "Can I give you another hug?" she asked, grinning mischievously. James laughed, a sound of pure joy that echoed through the private room. "I think under these circumstances, protocol allows for it," he said, opening his arms. The second hug was different from the first, less spontaneous but equally meaningful. It was the embrace of old friends, people whose lives had been permanently enriched by a moment of connection that transcended all boundaries of age, nationality, and social convention. Years later, both Emma and James would look back on their encounter as a defining moment in their lives. For Emma, it reinforced her belief in the power of kindness and gave her the confidence to approach the world with an open heart. For James, it reminded him that true service comes from the heart, and that the greatest honor lies not in perfect execution of duty, but in perfect recognition of our shared humanity. The viral video continued to be shared and reshared, becoming one of those rare internet phenomena that inspired rather than divided. Comments from around the world told similar stories of people being moved to perform their own acts of kindness, creating a chain reaction of compassion that stretched far beyond the palace gates where it all began. In the end, Emma's simple hug had done more than break protocol. It had reminded the world that beneath every uniform, every role, every social barrier, there are people who need to know that their efforts matter and that their humanity is seen and valued. It was a lesson that would continue to resonate long after both participants had moved on to the next chapters of their lives, carrying with them the eternal truth that kindness, once given freely, multiplies infinitely. The evening light was beginning to fade as word of the extraordinary encounter between Emma and James spread through both official channels and social media. The security officer who had witnessed the interaction, Constable Michael Davies, found himself in the unusual position of having to file a report about a protocol breach that had resulted in no harm and, arguably, had enhanced, rather than diminished, respect for the guards. Davies had been working palace security for 15 years and had seen every conceivable type of tourist behavior. He had broken up fights, removed drunk visitors, and dealt with countless attempts to provoke reactions from the stoic guards. But this afternoon's incident was unlike anything in his experience, and he was struggling to categorize it within the rigid framework of official procedures. Meanwhile, James completed his shift with a lightness in his step that hadn't been there for years. His fellow guards noticed the change immediately. Sergeant Robert Hayes, who had served alongside James for over a decade, commented on his unusually positive demeanor as they walked back to the barracks together. "Something different about today, Mitchell?" Hayes asked with the casual tone of long friendship. James considered his response carefully. The guard culture was built on stoicism and professional distance, and admitting to being emotionally affected by a tourist encounter could be seen as weakness. But the day's events had awakened something in him that refused to be suppressed. "Had a reminder today about why we do this job," James replied thoughtfully. "Sometimes we get so focused on the protocol that we forget we're serving people, not just institutions." Hayes raised an eyebrow but didn't press for details. The guards rarely discussed their personal reactions to duty, but he could sense that something significant had happened to his colleague. Back at their hotel, the Thompson family was processing their London experience over dinner. Emma had been unusually quiet during their evening meal, clearly still thinking about her interaction with James. Her parents exchanged glances, both recognizing that their daughter had been profoundly affected by the day's events. "Emma, sweetie, can you tell us what you were thinking when you hugged that guard today?" Sarah asked gently, genuinely curious about her daughter's perspective. Emma looked up from her fish and chips, her expression serious beyond her 8 years. "He looked lonely, Mommy, and tired, but also like he was doing something really important and nobody was saying thank you." Mark Thompson felt a lump form in his throat at his daughter's simple wisdom. "You were very brave to approach him like that. Were you scared?" "No," Emma replied without hesitation. "He had nice eyes. I could tell he was a good person, even though he couldn't smile or talk at first." Meanwhile, in the palace security office, Constable Davies was having an unusual conversation with his supervisor, Chief Inspector Patricia Williams. The incident report had crossed her desk and she was trying to understand exactly what had transpired and how to handle it administratively. "So let me understand this correctly," Williams said, reviewing Davies' written account. "An 8-year-old American tourist approached Sergeant Mitchell, thanked him for his service, hugged him without permission, and he responded by breaking posture, speaking to her, and expressing gratitude." Davies nodded, aware of how extraordinary it sounded when laid out in official language. "Yes, ma'am, but I have to emphasize that there was nothing disrespectful or inappropriate about the interaction. The child was genuinely moved by appreciation for the guard's service, and Sergeant Mitchell's response was entirely human and understandable." Williams had been in security for 25 years and had climbed through the ranks by maintaining strict adherence to protocol. But she was also a mother herself, and something about this incident struck her as representing the best aspects of both military service and childhood innocence. The real complication came later that evening when the first videos of the encounter began appearing on social media. A Japanese tourist had captured the entire interaction on her phone, from Emma's initial approach through James's emotional response. The footage was shaky, and the audio was poor, but the basic elements of the story were clear. Within hours, the video had been shared thousands of times across multiple platforms. The comments ranged from criticism of the protocol breach to celebration of the human moment, but the overwhelming response was positive. People around the world were touched by the simple gesture of a child recognizing the humanity of someone in service. The palace press office received dozens of calls from news outlets wanting to know more about the hugging guard incident. Social media accounts dedicated to royal watching were analyzing the footage frame by frame, debating whether disciplinary action would be taken and what this meant for the traditionally rigid protocols surrounding the guards. By the next morning, major news outlets in both Britain and America were running stories about the encounter. The headline in the Daily Mail read, "American Girl's Hug Breaks Royal Guard's Stoic Facade." CNN ran a piece titled, "When Protocol Meets Humanity, a Moment of Connection at Buckingham Palace." The attention created an unusual situation for palace administration. The incident was clearly a breach of protocol, But the public response was overwhelmingly positive. Disciplining James for responding with basic human decency to a child's kindness would likely create a public relations nightmare, while ignoring the protocol breach entirely could set a precedent that undermined the ceremonial standards. James arrived for his next shift to find that he had become something of a celebrity within the guard ranks. Some colleagues teased him good-naturedly about his fan mail, while others expressed genuine curiosity about what had made him break character so completely. The palace ultimately decided to handle the situation with characteristic British understatement. An official spokesman released a brief statement acknowledging that, while our guards maintain the highest standards of ceremonial protocol, they are also human beings who appreciate respectful recognition of their service. No disciplinary action was mentioned, effectively blessing James's response while maintaining official standards. For Emma and her family, the incident became the defining memory of their London trip. The viral video meant that friends and neighbors back in Ohio had seen their daughter's moment of international fame before they even returned home. But more importantly, Emma carried with her the knowledge that a simple act of kindness could bridge any divide and touch someone's heart in ways she never could have imagined. The encounter had changed both participants fundamentally, creating ripples that would continue to influence their lives and perspectives long after the cameras stopped rolling and the crowds moved on to other attractions. The seconds following Emma's hug stretched like hours as James stood frozen at the crossroads of duty and humanity. Every fiber of his training demanded that he remain motionless, unmoved, the perfect embodiment of royal protocol. But something deeper, something that connected him to his own father's service and his own daughter's love, was stirring within his chest. Emma stepped back and looked up at him with such genuine warmth and satisfaction that James felt his carefully constructed, professional walls beginning to crumble. Her small face glowed with the simple joy of having done something kind, completely unaware that she had just shattered decades of protocol with a gesture of pure innocence. The other tourists watched in stunned silence, their cameras forgotten as they witnessed something unprecedented. An elderly British gentleman who had been visiting the palace for 40 years stood with his mouth slightly open, having never seen anything like this breach of ceremonial boundaries. A young mother from Japan held her breath, recognizing the profound humanity of the moment despite not understanding all the cultural implications. James felt his vision blur slightly and realized with shock that tears were threatening to form in his eyes. In 23 years of service, through military deployments, ceremonial duties, and countless hours of rigid discipline, he had never once felt emotional while in uniform. But this child's simple act of kindness had reached a place in his heart that he had forgotten existed. The weight of his bearskin hat suddenly felt overwhelming, not from its physical mass but from the symbolic burden it represented. For decades that hat had been his shield, separating him from the world, marking him as something other than human. But Emma had looked past the uniform, past the ceremony, and had seen him simply as a person who might need comfort. Time seemed suspended as James made his decision. Moving with deliberate slowness, he lowered his gaze from its fixed forward position and looked directly down at Emma. The break in protocol was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who understood the rigid requirements of guard duty. Emma's face lit up as she realized he was looking at her, really seeing her as a person rather than just part of the background crowd. In his eyes, she saw not the blank professionalism she expected, but warmth, gratitude, and something that looked remarkably like the expression her grandfather had when she visited him in the nursing home. "Thank you," James whispered, the words barely audible but clearly visible to those close enough to see his lips move. The simple phrase carried the weight of years of suppressed appreciation for every kind gesture, every moment of understanding, every recognition of his humanity that protocol had never allowed him to acknowledge. The crowd began to murmur more audibly now, sensing that they were witnessing something historic. Several people raised their phones, understanding instinctively that this moment needed to be preserved. But rather than the typical tourist exploitation of guard baiting, this felt reverent, as if they were documenting something sacred. Sarah Thompson finally noticed that her daughter had wandered away and turned to see Emma standing before the guard in what appeared to be an intense moment of connection. Her first instinct was to call Emma back, to apologize for the breach of protocol. But something in the scene made her pause. The guard was looking at her daughter with such genuine warmth that it was clear this wasn't a discipline situation. James, slowly, carefully, began to lower himself toward Emma's level. The movement was unprecedented in the annals of Royal Guard duty, a complete departure from the rigid posture requirements that had governed his every moment in uniform. But in this instant, being a decent human being felt more important than being a perfect soldier. As he bent slightly forward, bringing his face closer to Emma's level, the massive bearskin hat shifted on his head. The cumbersome headpiece, designed more for ceremony than comfort, began to slide forward, threatening to tumble off entirely. James reached up with one white-gloved hand to steady it, the gesture so natural and unguarded that it seemed to strip away the last vestiges of ceremonial pretense. "You have a beautiful heart," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for seeing me as a person." Emma beamed at these words, feeling validated in her instinct that beneath the impressive uniform was someone who simply needed to know that his efforts were appreciated. "My daddy says that everyone has feelings, even when they can't show them," she replied with the wisdom that children sometimes possess beyond their years. The exchange was noticed by a nearby palace security officer, who began walking in their direction. James saw the approach and knew that the magical moment was about to end, that reality was about to reassert itself in the form of regulations and consequences. But rather than feeling regret, he felt only gratitude for the brief gift of human connection. "I have a little girl about your age," James told Emma quickly, aware that their time was running out. "She would like you very much. You both have brave, kind hearts." Emma's smile widened at this revelation. "What's her name?" she asked, but the security officer was now close enough to intervene. "Excuse me, miss," the officer said gently to Emma, his tone professional but not unkind. "I'm afraid we need to ask you to step back from the guard post." Sarah Thompson hurried forward, her face flushed with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry," she began. But James looked up at her with such a warm expression that her apology died in her throat. "No need for apologies," James said, his voice now returning to its more formal tone as he straightened back to his proper position. "Your daughter is a credit to your family. She has shown exceptional kindness and respect." The security officer looked between James and the family, clearly uncertain how to handle this unusual situation. Protocol demanded certain responses, but the genuine emotion and positive nature of the interaction made standard procedures seem inadequate. Emma waved at James as her parents gently guided her away from the guard post. "Bye," she called out cheerfully. "I hope you have a wonderful day." James, now back in his regulation posture but with his eyes still tracking the family's departure, managed one final slight nod of acknowledgement. The gesture was small enough to maintain professional decorum, but clear enough to let Emma know that her kindness had been received and treasured. As the Thompson family walked away, other tourists began to approach James with new understanding. The brief, humanizing moment had changed the entire dynamic of the space, transforming him from a mere attraction into a person worthy of respect and consideration. The late afternoon sun painted the palace walls in golden hues as Emma Thompson made her fateful decision. Her parents had become engrossed in conversation with a tour guide about the history of the monarchy, giving Emma a few moments of relative independence. She had been watching James for nearly an hour now, studying his unwavering dedication and remembering the brief moment of connection they had shared. In her 8-year-old mind, Emma had constructed a simple but powerful narrative. Here was a person doing a difficult job, standing perfectly still for hours in heavy clothing under the hot sun, unable to respond to mockery or accept thanks for his service. To her, it seemed deeply unfair that someone working so hard to protect important things couldn't even receive a simple acknowledgement of their efforts. Emma had grown up in a household where hugs were the universal solution to problems. When she was sad, her mother hugged her. When her father had a hard day at work, the family gathered for group hugs. When her grandmother felt lonely, Emma's hugs always seemed to brighten her day. In her innocent worldview, A hug was the most natural way to show someone that they mattered, that they were seen and appreciated as a person. James, meanwhile, was experiencing something unprecedented in his 23 years of service. The afternoon had been more emotionally challenging than usual, not because of any external pressures, but because of an internal shift he couldn't quite understand. The child's defense of him earlier had awakened something that his professional training had taught him to suppress: the basic human need to be recognized and valued as an individual. Throughout his career, James had taken pride in his ability to disappear into the role, to become the embodiment of tradition and duty rather than a person with feelings and needs. But today, perhaps triggered by thoughts of his own daughter or the genuine kindness he had witnessed, his emotional armor felt less secure than usual. The palace courtyard was quieter now, with only a handful of tourists remaining. Most families, with young children, had moved on to other attractions, leaving behind the more dedicated royal watchers and photography enthusiasts. The reduced crowd created an atmosphere that felt more intimate, less like a performance and more like a genuine human encounter. Emma noticed that her parents were still deep in conversation with the guide, their attention focused on architectural details and historical anecdotes. She looked back at James standing so perfectly still, and made her decision with the swift certainty that only children possess when they know something is right. She began walking toward the guard post, her small legs carrying her across the courtyard with determined steps. Other tourists noticed her movement, some smiling at the sight of a child's fearless approach to the imposing figure in red. A few people reached for their cameras, sensing that something interesting was about to happen. James's peripheral vision caught the movement, and his trained awareness immediately catalogued the approaching child. Protocol dictated that he should remain motionless, that any interaction would be handled by other security personnel if necessary. But something about the purposeful way Emma was walking, the gentle expression on her young face, told him this wasn't a typical tourist encounter. Emma stopped directly in front of James, close enough that she had to crane her neck to look up at his face beneath the imposing bearskin hat. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the child and the guard, separated by decades of age and worlds of experience, but connected by something ineffable and pure. "Thank you for protecting the Queen," Emma said in a clear, sweet voice that carried across the quiet courtyard. "You're doing a really good job, and I think you're very brave." The words hit James with unexpected force. In all his years of service, through countless ceremonies and endless hours of guard duty, no one had ever directly thanked him for his service while he was on duty. The simple, sincere gratitude from this child reached past his professional defenses and touched something deep in his heart. Emma saw the slight softening in his eyes, the almost imperceptible relaxation in his facial muscles that suggested her words had been received and appreciated. Emboldened by this response, she made her next move with the fearless compassion that only innocence can inspire. "You look like you could use a hug," she said simply. And before anyone could react, before protocol could intervene, before the weight of tradition could stop her, Emma stepped forward and wrapped her small arms around James's legs, pressing her cheek against the rough fabric of his red tunic. The moment seemed to freeze in time. Other tourists stopped their conversations, cameras paused mid-shot, and even the pigeons seemed to still their movement. The breach of protocol was so unexpected, so gentle, so completely innocent, that no one quite knew how to respond. James felt the small arms around his legs, the trust and affection in the child's gesture, and something inside him broke open. 23 years of rigid discipline, of suppressing every human impulse in service of duty, suddenly felt less important than this moment of pure human connection. His training screamed at him to maintain position, to remain unmoved, to uphold the standards he had sworn to represent. But his heart, his fundamental humanity, recognized the gift he was being offered. This wasn't mockery or boundary testing or attention-seeking behavior. This was a child offering comfort to someone she perceived as needing kindness, without thought for rules or consequences or social expectations. The hug lasted perhaps 10 seconds, though it felt both eternal and instantaneous. Emma squeezed gently, trying to communicate through touch all the appreciation and respect she felt for his service. James stood frozen, torn between protocol and humanity, feeling the weight of tradition and the lightness of innocent love in equal measure. Other tourists began to realize what they were witnessing, and some started to murmur among themselves. A few people raised their cameras, understanding that they were seeing something remarkable, something that challenged their preconceptions about the untouchable nature of these ceremonial guards. Emma finally stepped back, looking up at James, with a satisfied smile. "There," she said, as if she had just completed an important task. Everyone deserves a hug sometimes. The moment of truth had arrived. James stood at a crossroads between the duty that had defined his adult life and the human response that everything in his heart demanded. The next few seconds would determine not just how this encounter ended, but how both he and Emma would remember this day for the rest of their lives. The afternoon heat was beginning to build as Emma Thompson found herself growing restless during the family's extended tour of Westminster Abbey. While her parents marveled at the ancient stones and whispered histories, Emma's mind kept drifting, back to the guard she had seen that morning. Something about his eyes had stayed with her, the way they seemed kind despite his serious expression. "Can we go back to see the guards again?" Emma asked her mother as they exited the Abbey. Sarah checked her watch and realized they had some time before their scheduled afternoon tea. The family had planned to revisit Buckingham Palace anyway, hoping to catch another glimpse of the famous ceremony and perhaps get better photographs. Meanwhile, James was well into his afternoon shift, the sun now beating down on his heavy uniform. Sweat trickled beneath his red tunic, but his training had long ago taught him to ignore physical discomfort. His feet ached in the polished boots, and the weight of the bearskin hat created a constant pressure on his neck, but his posture remained perfect, his gaze unwavering. The afternoon crowd was different from the morning rush. Fewer tour groups, more individual families taking their time to explore. James had learned to catalog the different types of tourists over the years. The hurried ones checking items off their London bucket list, the respectful history buffs who understood the significance of what they were witnessing, and the occasional troublemaker looking to provoke a reaction. But as the Thompson family approached the gates again, James found his trained peripheral vision picking up on the small figure of Emma, her bright yellow dress making her easy to spot among the adults. She moved with the unhurried curiosity of childhood, stopping to examine details that others missed, asking questions that made her parents smile. Emma positioned herself at the same spot along the fence where she had stood that morning, her small hands gripping the metal bars as she studied James with unabashed fascination. This time, her parents were more engaged in conversation with another American family they had met, comparing travel experiences and sharing photography tips. "That one's my favorite," Emma announced to no one in particular, pointing toward James. A British woman standing nearby smiled at the child's enthusiasm. "Why's that, love?" the woman asked with genuine interest. Emma considered the question seriously, tilting her head as she watched James. "He looks like he has stories to tell, and his eyes are nice even though he can't smile right now." The British woman chuckled softly. "You've got good instincts, little one. These guards are all very special people. They've dedicated their lives to serving the Queen and protecting our traditions." As the afternoon wore on, Emma remained fascinated by the guards' unwavering dedication. She watched as tourists tried various tactics to get reactions: funny faces, silly dances, loud jokes. The guards remained perfectly still, professional in every way. But Emma noticed something others missed: the slight tension around James's eyes when children got too close to the barriers. Not from annoyance, but from what seemed like concern. A group of teenagers had gathered near the fence, their voices growing louder as they dared each other to try increasingly bold attempts to break the guards' composure. One boy started making exaggerated military gestures, mocking the precision of the guards' movements. Another pulled out his phone to record what he hoped would be a viral moment of guard baiting. Emma watched with growing discomfort as the teenagers' behavior became more disrespectful. She had been raised to treat others with kindness, and something about their mockery felt wrong to her. The guards couldn't defend themselves or respond, which made the teenager's actions seem particularly unfair. James, for his part, had encountered this type of behavior countless times. Part of his training involved maintaining composure in the face of disrespect, understanding that he represented something larger than himself. But today, perhaps influenced by the morning's gentle connection with the thoughtful child, the mockery felt more personal than usual. The teenagers grew bolder, one of them shouting crude jokes while another made inappropriate gestures. Other tourists began to look uncomfortable, some moving away from the area, others shooting disapproving glances at the group. Emma's parents, finally noticing the commotion, started to guide their daughter away from the scene. But Emma resisted, her 8-year-old sense of justice firmly activated. She had seen kindness in James's eyes, had recognized his humanity beneath the ceremonial exterior, and she couldn't bear to watch him being treated as nothing more than an object of entertainment. "That's not nice," she said loudly enough for the teenagers to hear, her small voice carrying the moral authority that only children possess. Several adults turned to look at her, including her surprised parents. The teenagers paused in their antics, momentarily thrown off by the unexpected intervention from such a young voice. One of them laughed nervously, clearly embarrassed to be called out by a child. The moment of disruption was enough to break their momentum, and the group began to disperse. Their enthusiasm for guard baiting diminished. Emma turned back to James, and for a moment, their eyes met again. This time, the connection lasted longer, and Emma could have sworn she saw gratitude in his gaze. The brief exchange was noticed by her mother, who had been watching the entire interaction with growing amazement at her daughter's compassion. "Emma, that was very brave of you to speak up," Sarah whispered, kneeling beside her daughter. "But we should be careful about getting too close to the guards. They have very important jobs to do." Emma nodded solemnly, but her gaze remained fixed on James. Something had shifted in that moment of silent communication, a recognition that transcended the barriers of protocol and duty. She had seen his gratitude, and he had witnessed her courage in defending him. As the afternoon crowd began to thin, Emma made a decision that would soon challenge everything both she and James understood about appropriate behavior, royal protocol, and the boundaries that separate performers from their audience. The sun was beginning to cast longer shadows across the courtyard, and the changing light seemed to symbolize the change that was coming. Both James and Emma felt it, though neither could have articulated what was building between them. It was the recognition of shared humanity, the acknowledgement that beneath uniforms and tourist clothes, they were simply two people who had found unexpected connection in a world that often emphasizes division. The stage was set for an encounter that would test the limits of protocol and reveal the power of innocent compassion to bridge any divide. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for what felt like the 100th time. 23 years of service had taught him that perfect posture and unwavering discipline were not just expectations, but sacred duties. His polished black boots reflected the early light as tourists began gathering behind the Golden Gates, cameras ready to capture the famous changing of the guard ceremony. James had seen it all during his decades of service. Tourists who tried to make him laugh, children who waved enthusiastically hoping for a reaction, and countless visitors who pushed boundaries just to see if the stoic guards would break their legendary composure. He had mastered the art of remaining motionless, his face a mask of professional indifference even when faced with the most outrageous attempts to get his attention. This particular Tuesday morning seemed no different from thousands of others. The familiar weight of his bearskin hat, the ceremonial sword at his side, and the responsibility of representing the crown felt as natural as breathing. James took his position at the palace entrance, his eyes fixed straight ahead, prepared for another day of standing guard while the world watched. Among the growing crowd of tourists, a small family from Ohio had arrived early to secure the best viewing spot. Sarah Thompson, an elementary school teacher, stood with her husband Mark and their 8-year-old daughter Emma. They had saved for 2 years to make this dream trip to London, and seeing the famous guards was at the top of Emma's wish list. Emma, pressed her face against the cold metal bars of the gate, her eyes wide with wonder as she watched the guards take their positions. She had read about them in school, learned about their history and traditions, but seeing them in person felt magical. The bright red uniforms, the tall black hats, and their perfectly still postures made them seem like characters from a fairy tale come to life. "Daddy, why don't they move?" Emma whispered, tugging on her father's jacket. Mark smiled and explained, the tradition, how these guards were protecting the Queen's home and had to stay very serious and still while on duty. Emma nodded solemnly, but her curious 8-year-old mind was already working on ways to make them smile. As the ceremony began, James executed each movement with practiced precision. Every step, every turn, every gesture had been drilled into him through years of training. The tourists watched in fascination as the guards moved in perfect synchronization, their movements sharp and deliberate. The sound of their boots on stone echoed through the courtyard, creating a rhythm that spoke of centuries of tradition. But something was different about this morning that James couldn't quite identify. Perhaps it was the way the sunlight felt warmer on his face, or the particularly enthusiastic energy of the crowd. Maybe it was the letter he had received the night before from his own daughter, away at university, telling him how proud she was of his service. Whatever it was, there was a subtle shift in his usually impenetrable emotional armor. Emma had been watching James specifically, drawn to something in his bearing that seemed different from the other guards. While her parents took photos and marveled at the spectacle, she found herself focusing on this one guard, sensing something beyond the rigid exterior. Children often possess an intuition that adults have lost, and Emma felt a connection she couldn't explain. The ceremony continued flawlessly, each guard performing their role to perfection. James maintained his position, aware of the hundreds of eyes upon him, the cameras recording every moment. This was more than a job. It was a sacred trust passed down through generations of soldiers who had stood in these same spots, protecting the same traditions, upholding the same values. As the formal ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, most tourists satisfied with their photos and memories, Emma lingered. She watched as the guards prepared to return to their posts. For the long hours of static duty that would follow, something in her heart told her that these weren't just uniformed statues, but real people with real feelings beneath those impressive exteriors. Sarah called for Emma to come along, but the little girl remained transfixed. She had noticed something the adults had missed. A fleeting moment when James had glanced toward the crowd and their eyes had met for just an instant. In that brief connection, she had seen not just a guard, but a person who might appreciate a simple gesture of human kindness. The stage was set for an encounter that would challenge protocol, test years of training, and reveal the humanity that exists beneath even the most disciplined exterior. Emma's innocent heart was about to create a moment that would be remembered long after the tourists had returned home and the guards had completed their duties. James returned to his post, settling into the familiar routine of motionless vigilance. The morning had been successful, the ceremony executed without flaw, and now came the long hours of static duty that required equal measures of physical endurance and mental discipline. He focused on his breathing, his posture, his unwavering gaze straight ahead. But in the back of his mind, he carried the memory of bright, curious eyes that had looked at him not as a tourist attraction, but as a person worthy of attention and care. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years of service, and it stirred something deep within his well-guarded heart. The morning sun climbed higher, the crowd thinned, and the palace settled into its daily rhythm. Neither James nor Emma knew that their brief connection was about to blossom into something that would challenge everything they both thought they knew about duty, protocol, and the power of human compassion.